He found her half dead in the sand, but the Apache widow's heart still burned with rage. The sun hung high in the sky, burning relentlessly over the endless stretch of desert. The sand shimmered like gold under its fierce heat, and the wind carried tiny grains that stung any exposed skin. John, a traveling trader, had been walking for hours, his leather boots sinking slightly into the hot sand with every step. His pack was heavy, filled with supplies and goods he had been transporting from one town to another. The desert had always been harsh, but he knew its ways: the shifting dunes, the hidden rocks, the sudden gusts of wind that could blind a man if he wasn't careful. Yet even with his experience, he never expected to encounter what he found that day. As he crested a small dune, he noticed something unusual. A small mound of sand appeared to move slightly, almost like a ripple. At first he thought it was a trick of the light or a mirage, common illusions in the desert. But as he stepped closer, his heart skipped a beat. Beneath the golden sand he saw a form, a person, barely moving, half buried, as if the desert itself had tried to swallow her. The sight was shocking, and a pang of fear and urgency gripped him. He ran the final few steps and dropped to his knees beside her. Her clothes were torn, and her skin was covered in scratches and bruises. Dust clung to every part of her body, and her breathing was shallow and uneven. She was alive, but just barely. John's hands shook as he reached for her, gently pulling away the sand that clung to her face and hair. She stirred slightly, letting out a weak moan, but her eyes were half closed, and her body seemed too weak to respond. His heart raced. He had seen travelers suffer in the desert before, but this was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. She looked like she had been through a battle, yet the strength of her spirit was still faintly visible, flickering like a candle in the wind. "Can you hear me?" he whispered, unsure if she could respond. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes that burned with an intensity he could not ignore. They were dark and fierce, filled not with fear but with something else: anger, sorrow, and defiance all wrapped together. Even in her near collapse, she seemed unbroken. John realized that she was not just a survivor of the desert. She was someone who had faced life's cruelest trials and refused to surrender. He quickly took off his scarf and dampened it with the little water he had left. He pressed it to her lips, encouraging her to drink, careful not to force her. She coughed weakly, water spilling over her lips, but she managed to swallow a little. John could feel her body trembling, not only from exhaustion, but also from the cold sweat that had formed under the scorching sun. He carefully lifted her into his arms. Her small frame seemed almost weightless, but he could feel the tension in her muscles, the way she fought against letting herself be carried, even in her weakened state. He scanned the area, looking for any sign of danger. The desert was vast, and the nearest settlement was miles away. He knew he would have to move quickly if she was to survive. The sun beat down on them mercilessly, and the sand burned under his boots. He kept talking softly, more to keep himself calm than for her. "You're going to be okay. I'll get you out of here," he said. He didn't know if she could hear him, but speaking the words gave him purpose, a focus that kept panic at bay. Hours seemed to pass as he carefully made his way toward a small patch of shade formed by a lone mesquite tree. The desert was unforgiving, and every step was a struggle, both for him and for the fragile body he carried. The wind whipped around them and the sand stung his face, but he refused to stop. He could feel her breathing, shallow but steady, and that gave him hope. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the small shelter. He laid her down gently, careful not to jostle her fragile form. John looked at her closely now, noticing the details he hadn't seen before. Her hair was matted and dusty, and her skin was sunburned in places, with fresh scratches marking her arms and legs. Her clothes were torn in several places, evidence of some violent encounter, though it was unclear exactly what had happened. Despite all this, her eyes remained fierce, alert even in her weakness. He realized that this was no ordinary traveler. She was someone who had endured horrors that most people could not even imagine, yet her spirit had not been crushed. He retrieved his small first aid kit from his pack and began cleaning her wounds as best as he could. The cuts were raw and painful looking, and he knew they needed proper care soon, but this was the best he could manage in the middle of the desert. As he worked, he kept talking, telling her about the nearest town, about the supplies he had, and about the water and food that would soon be available. He didn't know if she understood, but he hoped that the sound of his voice would provide some comfort. Gradually, she began to stir more noticeably. Her eyes opened fully, and she looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and defiance. She tried to sit up, but her body shook violently. John quickly steadied her, gently pushing her back onto the makeshift bed of sand and cloth he had fashioned. She looked at him silently for a long moment, and then, without words, she allowed herself to rest. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the desert, John could finally allow himself a brief moment of reflection. He had saved her life, but he knew that her survival depended on more than just physical rescue. Her eyes, still bright with fury and determination, told him that she had been through terrible things, and that whatever had caused her suffering was far from over. He realized that while he had found her half dead in the sand, the journey ahead would test not only her body but her spirit. Night fell, bringing with it a biting chill that contrasted sharply with the heat of the day. John built a small fire, careful to shield it from the wind, and managed to heat some water. He coaxed her into drinking slowly, supporting her as she sipped. She accepted the warmth reluctantly, her gaze never leaving the horizon as if she was always ready for whatever danger might appear next. There was a strength in her silence, a quiet intensity that John could not ignore. He understood that this woman had a story, a past filled with loss and pain, and that story was far from over. Hours passed with little movement, save for the occasional cough or shiver. John stayed by her side, watching over her as she slept fitfully. He couldn't help but think about the circumstances that had brought her to this point. The desert took many lives, but it also revealed the resilience of those who survived it. He wondered what she had endured, who had caused her injuries, and what drove the fire in her eyes. Even half dead in the sand, she radiated a fierce energy that refused to be extinguished. By the time the moon rose high in the night sky, John knew one thing with certainty: saving her body was only the beginning. The true challenge lay in understanding the strength and anger that burned within her, a fire that had survived even the harshest trials of the desert. He had rescued her from death, but he realized that her journey was far from over. The desert was vast, full of danger and uncertainty, but together, at least for now, they had found a small measure of safety. And in that fragile safety, the story of the Apache widow's fury and resilience was only just beginning to unfold. The morning sun rose slowly over the desert, casting a soft golden light over the sand dunes. The air was cooler than the day before, but it still carried the harsh dryness of the desert. John stirred quietly, careful not to wake the woman lying beside him. Her breathing was steady now, but she had not moved much through the night. He could see the marks of exhaustion on her face, the bruises slowly darkening as her body tried to heal. Despite her weakness, there was a tension in her posture, a subtle reminder that even in rest, she was alert and ready for anything. When she finally opened her eyes, they met John's gaze with the same intensity he had noticed the day before. There was a sharpness in them, like a flame that refused to die, and he realized that she was not just physically hurt. Her spirit carried scars that went much deeper. He offered a soft smile and a small nod, trying to show that he meant no harm. For a moment, she looked away, her eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting danger to appear at any second. John understood then that her anger, her pain, and her fear were all tied together. This was a woman who had lost much but had refused to break, refusing even in the face of near death. She spoke at last, her voice low and steady but laced with pain. "I was attacked," she said simply. There was no anger in her tone yet, only a quiet statement of fact. "My husband, they took him from me. I barely escaped." Her words were heavy with meaning. John felt a wave of sorrow and respect wash over him. He had seen suffering before, but there was something different in the way she carried hers. It was raw, real, and unfiltered. He nodded slowly. "I can only imagine, but you're safe now. You're alive, and we'll get you somewhere you can heal." He tried to offer reassurance, but he knew it would take more than words to ease the storm in her heart. She didn't respond immediately, only turning her gaze back toward the desert as though the vast emptiness itself held the answer she sought. John realized that while he had saved her body, understanding her past and her pain was a far greater challenge. As she began to regain strength, she revealed small pieces of her story. Her husband had been a respected member of their community, a brave man who had always protected his people. But a group of ruthless men had attacked their village, leaving destruction in their wake. She had watched helplessly as her life, and the life of her family, was torn apart. The memory of that night seemed to haunt her, even now. Every word she spoke carried the weight of loss and betrayal, and John could see her hands clench involuntarily as she recalled the moments that had nearly ended her life. Despite the tragedy she had endured, she was not broken. There was a fire in her that refused to be extinguished, a determination that burned brighter than any fear. John admired that, but he also understood that her anger would not be easily soothed. She had been wronged in the most terrible way, and she had every reason to feel the way she did. The desert, harsh and unyielding, seemed almost tame compared to the storm that raged within her. Over the next few days, John helped her recover as best as he could. He scavenged what little food and water he had, sharing it sparingly but carefully, making sure she regained some of her strength. Each day, she walked a little farther, drank a little more, and spoke a little more. Slowly, her story unfolded. She had been alone in the desert for days, fleeing from men who had shown no mercy. She had survived on sheer willpower, refusing to surrender even when every instinct told her to give up. Her survival had been an act of defiance, a refusal to allow evil to claim her completely. As she grew stronger, her anger became more evident. It was not a fleeting annoyance but a deep, burning rage that seemed to fuel her every movement. John could see it in her eyes, in the way she spoke of the men who had attacked her village. She did not just want to survive. She wanted justice, revenge, and closure for the pain that had been inflicted upon her. John understood that this was a fire that could not be easily doused. He respected her anger, even as he worried about the danger it might bring. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert in shades of red and orange, she spoke to him quietly. "I will not rest until they pay for what they did," she said, her voice firm despite her weakened state. John listened carefully, understanding both the danger and the determination in her words. He wanted to help her, but he also knew that facing those who had caused her suffering would be perilous. Yet he could not deny the truth. Her heart burned with a righteous fury, and it would not be silenced by fear or caution. He asked her gently about her past, about the life she had before the attack, hoping to learn more about the woman he had rescued. She told him about her family, her husband, and the community that had been destroyed. Each memory seemed to strengthen her resolve, reinforcing the fire that drove her forward. John realized that this woman had been forged in pain, her anger not a weakness, but a source of strength. It was a reminder that some wounds, though invisible, could shape a person far more than physical injuries ever could. Despite the danger she still faced, she began to trust him in small ways. She allowed him to help her with basic tasks, to fetch water, and to provide some care for her wounds. There was still a distance between them, a barrier built by years of hardship and betrayal, but it was slowly beginning to erode. John knew that trust would not come easily, but he also knew that if he could help her channel her anger into something constructive, she might find the strength not only to survive, but to reclaim her life. The desert around them was quiet, almost serene, yet it was a constant reminder of the harsh world they lived in. Every gust of wind, every shifting dune seemed to whisper of the challenges ahead. She watched the horizon constantly, alert to any sign of danger, and John admired her vigilance. He knew that her anger was not just personal but a reflection of the injustices she had witnessed. It was a fire born from suffering, from loss, and from the desire to survive in a world that had shown her cruelty. Over time, John began to understand her better. He saw that her rage was not reckless but calculated, fueled by memories and a desire for justice. She was careful, thinking through every action, weighing every decision. Even in her weakened state, she demonstrated a sharp intelligence and an unyielding determination. John realized that he had not merely rescued a woman from the desert. He had discovered someone whose spirit was indomitable, someone whose heart carried a fire that could not be quenched by fear or hardship. Days turned into a week, and she grew stronger with each passing day. She began to move with more confidence, her steps steadier, her gaze sharper. The anger in her eyes remained, but it was now paired with a clarity of purpose. John watched her, fascinated by the balance of vulnerability and strength, of pain and determination. He knew that the journey ahead would be dangerous, but he also knew that she was capable of facing whatever challenges came their way. One evening, as the sky darkened and the stars began to shine, she spoke quietly about her plans. "I cannot stay here forever," she said. "I need to face them. I need to make them pay for what they've done." John listened carefully, understanding both the danger and the necessity of her words. He wanted to protect her, to ensure her safety, but he also understood that this was her path to reclaiming her life. The anger in her heart, though dangerous, was also her guide, leading her toward justice and closure. John knew that helping her would require more than physical strength. It would require patience, understanding, and the ability to navigate the storm of emotions that raged within her. But he also knew that if anyone could face the challenges ahead, it was this fierce Apache widow. She had survived the desert, had endured pain and betrayal, and had emerged not as a victim, but as a force to be reckoned with. Her heart burned with rage, yes, but it also burned with life, determination, and the will to survive. As the night deepened, the desert became quiet around them, but the fire within her remained. John sat beside her, keeping watch, understanding that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But for now, they had a moment of peace, a fragile respite from the harshness of the world. And in that moment, he realized something profound. He had found not just a survivor, but a woman whose spirit was unbreakable, whose courage was unmatched, and whose journey had only just begun. The days in the desert passed slowly, each one blending into the next with the same harsh sun, the same shifting sands, and the same unforgiving wind. Yet amidst this vast emptiness, a fragile routine had formed between John and the Apache widow. She had regained much of her strength, moving with more confidence, and her sharp eyes now observed the desert with purpose rather than fear. John continued to provide food, water, and care, but he also recognized that the woman before him was no ordinary traveler. She carried a fire within her that was both dangerous and inspiring, a strength that could not be diminished even after everything she had endured. Slowly, a bond began to form between them, though it was a quiet one, unspoken and tentative. She had been hurt too deeply to trust easily, yet there was something in John's steady presence that allowed her to let her guard down, just a little. She still flinched at sudden movements, still scanned the horizon as if anticipating danger, but she no longer recoiled from him. He had become a witness to her suffering, someone who saw both her pain and her strength, and in that understanding, a subtle connection began to grow. Even as their days together became routine, her anger simmered beneath the surface. It was not the fleeting frustration of ordinary life. It was a deep, burning rage, born from betrayal and loss. She spoke little of it, but John could see the way her hands clenched, the tightness in her jaw, and the intensity in her eyes whenever she thought of the men who had destroyed her life. He understood that this anger was not weakness or cruelty. It was a source of strength, a fuel that had kept her alive through days of fear, hunger, and pain. One morning, as the wind swept across the dunes, John asked her softly, "Do you want to talk about them?" "The ones who hurt you," she paused, staring into the distance, the desert stretching endlessly before her. Her voice was quiet but firm when she finally spoke. "I will not rest until I face them. They took everything from me. My family, my home, my husband. I will not let them escape." Her words carried a mix of sorrow and determination, and John felt a shiver run down his spine. He had encountered anger before, but hers was focused, deliberate, and unwavering. Over the next few days, she began to share more of her past, piece by piece. She spoke of her village, a small community that had lived in harmony with the desert for generations. Her husband had been a respected man, brave and kind, and together they had lived a life rooted in tradition and care for their people. But that life had been torn apart in a single night of violence. Raiders had struck without warning, leaving destruction, death, and despair in their wake. She had escaped by chance, running through the desert with nothing but the clothes on her back and the will to survive. The story of her survival was remarkable, and John listened with a mixture of awe and sorrow. Despite the pain she carried, there was a sharp intelligence in her words, a clarity of thought that made it clear she had not been broken. She had endured more than most people could imagine, and yet she spoke with precision, remembering details others might forget in trauma. She knew the desert as intimately as she knew herself, using its terrain to hide, to find water, and to survive against overwhelming odds. John realized that this woman was not just a survivor. She was a strategist, someone whose mind and body had been honed by necessity and hardship. As they traveled short distances each day, seeking small sources of water and safer places to rest, their bond grew stronger. She allowed him to help her with wounds, to carry supplies, and even to share small moments of conversation. Yet even in these moments, her heart remained guarded. She was learning to trust, but slowly, cautiously, always aware that betrayal could come at any moment. John respected her caution, understanding that her anger and vigilance were not flaws but shields that had kept her alive. One afternoon, they reached a small canyon that offered some shelter from the sun. She crouched low, her eyes scanning the horizon as John unpacked what little supplies remained. For a moment they sat in silence, listening to the faint whispers of the wind through the rocks. Then she spoke, her voice low but resolute. "I have to find them. I cannot wait. They think they can destroy people and escape. I will make them understand that they cannot." John nodded slowly, understanding her resolve, though a part of him feared for her safety. He had come to care for her, not just as a survivor, but as a person with a spirit that refused to yield. He tried to reason with her, cautioning her about the dangers of confronting the men while she was still recovering. "We can wait until you are stronger," he said. "You need your full strength for what comes next." She shook her head, her expression unyielding. "I have strength enough," she replied. "Every day I wait, they escape justice. I cannot let them." Her determination was unshakable, and John realized that no amount of caution could deter her once her mind was set. During their quiet moments together, he began to notice the small details of her resilience. She moved carefully but deliberately, conserving her energy while also pushing herself to grow stronger. She thought ahead, planning each step in the harsh desert terrain, and she learned quickly from any mistake. John found himself both impressed and humbled by her intelligence and resourcefulness. She was a woman shaped by tragedy, but also by courage, skill, and determination, qualities that made her truly formidable. At night, as the stars emerged in the vast desert sky, she would sit quietly, staring at the horizon. John sometimes joined her, offering water or warmth from the small fire he maintained. She rarely spoke during these moments, but her presence was comforting, a reminder that even in a world filled with cruelty and loss, there was still strength and determination. He wondered about the depth of her pain, the memories she carried, and the fire that drove her forward. And he realized that helping her would require more than care for her body. It would require understanding, patience, and a respect for the anger that had kept her alive. One evening, as the wind blew gently through the canyon, she finally shared the depth of her grief. Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes remained fierce. "I have lost everything," she said. "My husband, my home, my family, and yet I am still alive. How can I forgive those who took it all?" John remained silent, listening carefully. He understood that her anger was a shield, a source of strength, and a guide. It was not simply hatred, it was determination, the refusal to allow injustice to prevail. In the following days, they began to prepare for what lay ahead. She studied the desert, noting paths and possible hiding spots, always thinking ahead. John helped her gather supplies, but he quickly realized that her knowledge of the land far exceeded his own. She had survived the desert before, and she could navigate it with skill and precision. Together, they planned cautiously, knowing that every step forward could bring them closer to danger. Yet her courage never wavered, and John admired the clarity of purpose she carried despite the immense challenges they faced. As the days passed, it became clear that their bond had shifted from simple survival to mutual respect and understanding. She trusted him enough to accept help, yet retained her independence and determination. He realized that he was no longer just a rescuer, he was a companion, someone who shared in her struggles and supported her journey. And she, despite her anger and grief, was learning to allow someone into her life without losing the fire that defined her. Through it all, the desert remained both an adversary and a teacher. It reminded them of the fragility of life, the importance of vigilance, and the strength required to endure. For the Apache widow, it was a mirror of her own life, harsh, unforgiving, yet full of lessons and opportunities for resilience. John observed her closely, understanding that her journey was not merely about survival, but about reclaiming control over her destiny, even in the face of immense hardship. As part 3 of their journey drew to a close, John realized that the woman he had rescued was no longer just fragile or wounded. She was a force, a combination of courage, intelligence, and anger that demanded respect. Her heart still burned with rage, yes, but it was a controlled, purposeful fire, one that would guide her toward justice and closure. He knew that the next stage of their journey would be the most dangerous, but he also knew that together, they could face the challenges ahead. The desert was quiet that morning, the wind gentle, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant shrubs. John and the Apache widow had prepared for days, carefully mapping out a path that would take them closer to the men who had caused her so much pain. Every step had been measured, every decision deliberate. She had regained much of her strength, and the fire in her eyes was sharper than ever. It was no longer just survival that drove her. It was justice, a need to confront those who had destroyed her life and to make them understand the cost of their cruelty. John tried to caution her, reminding her that rushing into danger could be fatal. "We need to be careful," he said, keeping his voice calm. "They are dangerous men. We cannot afford mistakes." She shook her head, her expression unyielding. "Careful is good, but waiting too long will let them escape. I will face them. I have waited too long already." There was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt in her eyes. John realized that arguing was pointless. Her determination was as solid as the desert rock, and it would take more than words to change her mind. They began their journey early, moving through the desert with caution. She led the way, her knowledge of the terrain evident in every step. She pointed out hidden pathways, shaded spots to rest, and small sources of water she had discovered on previous journeys. John followed closely, carrying supplies and keeping watch for any signs of danger. Though he had been cautious at first, he quickly realized that her instincts were sharp and precise. She had survived unimaginable hardship, and her ability to read the land was almost unmatched. As they traveled, she spoke little of her emotions, yet her focus never wavered. Every so often, she would glance at the horizon, her eyes narrowing as she imagined the faces of the men who had destroyed her life. John understood that her anger was not blind. It was calculated, fueled by memories of loss and betrayal. Every step forward was not only a movement toward justice, but also a preparation for what would come, a confrontation that would test both her strength and her resolve. By midday, they reached a rocky ridge that overlooked a narrow valley below. From this vantage point, she could see a small camp in the distance, the outlaws' hideout. Her hands clenched, and John could feel the tension radiating from her. "There they are," she said quietly. "They think they can hide. They think they can escape. But they cannot." Her voice was calm but carried the weight of determination, the kind that comes from years of suffering and survival. John nodded, keeping his own fears in check. He knew she was ready, but he also knew the danger they faced. She spent the afternoon observing the camp, noting the number of men, their movements, and the layout of their temporary shelters. Every detail mattered to her. John watched in silent admiration as she made careful mental notes, planning her approach. Despite her anger, she was methodical, not reckless. Her strategy was clear: confront them with precision, strike when the moment was right, and ensure that they understood the consequences of their actions. He realized that her rage was not chaos, it was controlled, purposeful, and guided by intelligence. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, she turned to John. "I need to move closer," she said. "We cannot wait any longer. They will leave if we hesitate." He hesitated for a moment, worried for her safety, but he saw no fear in her eyes, only resolve. He had learned by now that her courage was unshakable, and arguing against her would achieve nothing. "Then we move together," he said. "But stay close. We cannot afford mistakes." She nodded, and together they began to descend carefully toward the valley below. The closer they got, the more alert she became. Every sound, every movement was scrutinized. She pointed out signs of recent activity, footprints in the sand, discarded tools, and the faint glow of a small fire. John followed her lead, trusting her instincts and her judgment. It was a tense journey, each step a balance between stealth and urgency. The desert that had once been a place of survival was now a stage for confrontation, and she was determined to face it with courage and intelligence. When they finally reached a position close enough to observe the outlaws without being seen, she crouched low, her eyes scanning every detail. John noticed the subtle ways she prepared herself, checking her supplies, adjusting her clothing, and taking deep, steadying breaths. She was not just physically ready, she was mentally prepared. Her anger, which had been a simmering fire for so long, now became a focused energy, guiding her every decision. John could feel the intensity in the air, a quiet tension that promised a confrontation unlike any they had faced before. As darkness approached, she made her move. Quietly and with precision, she navigated the shadows, moving closer to the camp while John followed at a safe distance. The men were unsuspecting, laughing and talking around their small fire, unaware that the woman they had wronged so deeply was approaching. Every step she took was calculated, every movement deliberate. Her eyes, fierce and determined, never left the target, and John realized that he was witnessing not just courage, but a form of justice that was about to be delivered. Finally, she reached a position where she could confront them directly. Her voice rang out, steady and commanding. "You will answer for what you have done." The outlaws froze, surprised and alarmed. Some reached for weapons, but her presence, her intensity and the fire in her eyes made it clear that she would not be intimidated. John moved closer, ready to assist if necessary, but he knew that this moment belonged to her. She was not merely seeking revenge. She was reclaiming her power, asserting that she would no longer be a victim. The confrontation was tense, words exchanged sharply, and the outlaws' surprise quickly turned to fear. She spoke with a calm authority, recounting their crimes and declaring the consequences of their actions. John watched in awe as she maintained control, her anger focused and her strategy clear. It was not a mindless outburst. It was a carefully calculated stand, a demonstration that she had survived unimaginable pain and was now demanding justice. As the night wore on, the outlaws began to retreat, realizing that they were facing more than just a survivor. They were facing a woman whose spirit and intelligence made her formidable. She allowed them to leave, not out of mercy, but because she had achieved what she set out to do, to confront them, assert her strength, and reclaim a measure of control over her life. John approached her as the men disappeared into the night, offering quiet support. She looked at him, her eyes still burning, and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. The desert returned to its quiet state, but the energy between them had shifted. She had faced her enemies and emerged with her dignity and strength intact. John realized that the journey had changed both of them. He had witnessed not only her courage, but also her ability to transform anger into action. Her fire, once a simmering rage, had become a force that could guide her forward, a testament to her resilience and determination. As they settled in for the night, the stars twinkling above the desert landscape, she allowed herself a small moment of rest. John kept watch, understanding that while the immediate danger had passed, the journey was not yet complete. She had confronted her past, but the road ahead would continue to test her strength, her courage, and her determination. And yet, for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of calm, a fragile peace that came from standing up to the forces that had sought to destroy her. In the quiet of the night, John reflected on the journey they had shared. He had come to the desert as a traveler, a mere observer, and found himself part of a story much greater than his own. The Apache widow had survived death, pain, and betrayal, and in doing so had taught him the meaning of courage, resilience, and the strength that comes from facing one's fears. Her heart still burned, yes, but it burned with purpose, guiding her toward a future where she could reclaim her life and her dignity. The desert air was crisp in the early morning, carrying with it a quiet sense of anticipation. The Apache widow rose before the sun, her eyes sharp and unwavering. She had faced the men who had destroyed her life, and though the immediate danger had passed, the weight of her journey still pressed upon her. John moved beside her, offering support, but it was clear that she was the one who carried the strength, the resolve, and the determination to finish what she had begun. Every movement she made was careful yet confident, a testament to the endurance she had cultivated over days and nights of hardship. As they prepared to leave their temporary camp, she spoke quietly but firmly. "The men are gone, but my work is not finished. I need to reclaim what was taken from me. I need to be certain that no one else suffers as I have." John nodded, understanding her resolve. He had seen her courage, her intelligence, and her fire, and he knew that nothing could deter her once she had set her mind to something. Her heart still burned with anger, but it was now tempered with purpose, a guiding force that gave her direction and focus. Their journey took them through the shifting dunes and rocky canyons of the desert, places where shadows stretched long in the early morning sun, and every step had to be measured. She moved with precision, her eyes scanning the land for signs of danger, yet she also carried herself with a quiet dignity. John watched her closely, admiring not only her strength but her ability to transform her anger into careful, deliberate action. Every step forward was a step toward reclaiming her life, toward asserting her right to survive and thrive despite the cruelty she had endured. As the day wore on, they came across small villages and trading posts, places where she could gather information and supplies. She asked questions quietly, observing the people around her, learning what she needed to know without drawing attention to herself. John marveled at her skill, the way she moved through the world with a combination of caution and confidence. Her anger had not made her reckless. Instead, it had sharpened her senses, honed her instincts, and given her a clarity of purpose that few could match. By mid-afternoon, they reached a small canyon that provided shelter and a vantage point over a narrow valley below. She crouched low, her eyes scanning every detail, every movement, every shadow. John could feel the tension in the air, a mix of anticipation, determination, and the lingering fire of her anger. She pointed out subtle signs, footprints, broken branches, faint smoke rising from a distant fire, that told her more about the movements of the men who had wronged her. Every observation was precise, every decision deliberate, and John realized that she had become a master of her environment, using the desert itself as an ally in her quest for justice. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, she spoke softly. "It is time," she said. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of determination. John prepared himself, knowing that the final confrontation was near. They moved carefully through the canyon, using the cover of rocks and shrubs to approach the area where the men had once been. She led the way, her focus absolute, her anger now a guiding force rather than a simmering flame. Every step brought them closer to closure, closer to reclaiming a sense of justice that had been denied for too long. When they reached the site, it was eerily quiet. The campfires had been extinguished, the men gone. Yet she did not hesitate. She moved through the area, examining every detail, leaving markers to track their movements. John followed, offering support, but it was clear that she was in command, her mind sharp and her senses alert. She had faced death, betrayal, and loss, and now she moved through the world with a confidence and purpose that left John in awe. As night fell, they finally found signs of the men's trail, leading them toward a small canyon where they had sought temporary shelter. She paused, crouched low, her eyes scanning every shadow. John could see the intensity in her gaze, the controlled fire in her heart, and he knew that the moment of reckoning had arrived. She whispered instructions, moving with precision, and together they approached the location, careful to remain unseen. Her strategy was flawless, her determination unwavering, and John realized that he had never encountered anyone with such courage and intelligence. The confrontation was swift and decisive. She confronted the men directly, her voice steady and commanding. "You will answer for what you have done," she declared. The outlaws were taken aback, startled by her presence and the intensity of her determination. Some reached for weapons, but she did not falter. Her anger, once a simmering fire, had become a focused force, guiding her actions and ensuring that she would not be intimidated. John stayed close, ready to assist if necessary, but it was clear that she had taken control of the situation completely. The men attempted to resist, but her strength, strategy, and unwavering resolve left them with no advantage. She spoke with clarity, recounting their crimes and making it clear that they would face consequences for their actions. Her fury was not reckless but calculated, directed toward justice rather than vengeance alone. John observed silently, impressed by her courage, her intelligence, and the way she maintained control even in the midst of confrontation. The desert, once a place of survival, had become a stage for her triumph, and she faced it with grace, determination, and power. Eventually, The men were forced to retreat, realizing that they could not escape the consequences of their actions. She allowed them to leave, not out of mercy, but because her goal had been achieved. She had confronted her past, asserted her strength, and reclaimed a measure of control over her life. John approached her as the men disappeared into the night, offering quiet support. She looked at him, her eyes still fierce but now carrying a hint of relief. The fire in her heart had not been extinguished, but it had been channeled into something constructive, into action, courage, and the reclaiming of her dignity. As they settled for the night, the desert calm and quiet around them, she allowed herself to rest. John kept watch, understanding that while the danger had passed, the journey of healing and reclaiming her life was ongoing. She had faced death, betrayal, and loss, and emerged not as a victim, but as a survivor, a woman whose courage and determination had allowed her to confront those who had harmed her and to reclaim her strength. Over the following days, they continued to travel together, moving through the desert with renewed purpose. She sought out resources, safe places to rest, and information that would help her rebuild her life. John provided support, but he knew that the Apache widow had become fully capable of navigating the challenges of the world around her. Her anger, once a force of pain and frustration, had become a guiding flame, directing her actions and ensuring that she would never again be powerless in the face of injustice. As they approached the edge of the desert, where the land began to change and signs of human settlement became visible, she paused and looked out over the horizon. Her eyes, still fierce, reflected the journey she had undertaken, a journey of survival, resilience, and courage. John stood beside her, silently acknowledging the transformation he had witnessed. She had survived the impossible, faced her enemies, and reclaimed her dignity. The desert had tested her, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. In that moment, she allowed herself a small smile, a quiet acknowledgement of her triumph and of the journey that had brought her here. John recognized that this smile was more than relief. It was a declaration of strength, a sign that she had reclaimed her power and her place in the world. The fire in her heart, once a blaze of rage, had become a steady, guiding light, illuminating the path toward a future she would shape for herself. As the sun rose the next morning, casting a golden glow over the desert, she took a deep breath and stepped forward with John beside her. The challenges of the past had been faced, the injustices confronted, and the path ahead, though uncertain, was now open. She had survived, fought, and emerged victorious, a woman whose courage and resilience would guide her through whatever the world might bring. And as they walked together, the desert stretching endlessly around them, it was clear that her story, one of survival, strength, and unyielding determination, had reached a powerful and inspiring conclusion.